he terms that inner space that they engage with in these creative meditations mundus imaginalis. It's the engagement of an inner world through imagination. In the case of something like the Sufis, they view this as spiritual work. We view it through the Jungian lens as psychological work. Certain Jungian authors and analysts themselves, like Jeffrey Rath, who wrote the book Jung and the Alchemical Imagination, he claims that active imagination is Jung's method for the transmutation of the soul. So here's somebody, who's a trained Jungian analyst who writes and understands the importance of alchemy and active imagination. And he doesn't mince any words. He brings the soul right into it. I think there's something to that.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. I've said it before. I'll say it probably many more times, but I'll say it again right now, that there is no normal, only familiar weirdness when it comes to the human experience. Because if you think about it, what is it? It's this stack of phenomena that feel normal by virtue of the fact that we've been in them for decades. But when you begin to investigate the core pieces of that phenomena, you find that it's all intensely nebulous, undefinable, uncapturable by empirical, scientific instrumentation. As familiar as it feels, though, at least in waking consensus reality sort of consciousness, as soon as one digs below the surface, the weirdness begins to make itself known. When we go into these realms we call the unconscious, the imagination, we enter symbolic, mythological territory. Territory that, by the way, seems to have a life of its own, seems to have a symbol system of its own. And of course, if we want to investigate the psyche, if we want to learn its mysteries, we have to go to these strange, unconscious, at least by normal standards, realms. And how does one do that? Of course, I'm not going to give a huge dissertation on that in this introduction, but in short, this is why I'm such a fan of thinkers like Jung, because he found a way. He pointed the flashlight where many other scientists were afraid to. Dreams, imagination, altered states, art, creative expression, which brings us to this mind meld with my wonder brother, MJDorian. MJ's pod, Creative Codex, is sincerely one of my favorites. His series on Jung and alchemy in particular is just so well researched, so well executed. You must give it a dip if you are into this stuff. MJ is really just a generally gifted, multidisciplinary creative, though. He paints, he's an incredible musician. He's just got that artistic je ne sais quoi. And as I'm sure you've gathered by now, we share a deep love for Jung and his psychospiritual ilk, and really all things esoteric, which, by the way, pretty well describes the vibe of this mind meld in general. And with that, all of the links that you're going to need for MJDorian are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. And on that note, I humbly ask that you currently tickle the algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. It is vitally important for the health and the propagation of this media vessel. I also must remind you that we have over 300 audio-only transmissions available only on podcast platforms. So if you're digging the content, do sub to Third Eye Drops on Apple Pods, Spotify, wherever you listen. And if you'd like to go deeper on all these topics that I just mentioned, join a community that's really largely obsessed with them, head over to patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. That's also the best way to support these transmissions. And for your altruism, you will get access to, like I said, a patron-only community, patron-only Discord server, monthly live Zoom hangs, rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more, only at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. And with that, my friends, let's meld minds with the wise, wonderful, whimsical MJDorian. One of the things that we largely share is this fascination with Jung, all of his methods for exploring the psyche, and for too many reasons to even, serve you up this question with, we both think there's tremendous value in exploring the unconscious, largely making the unconscious conscious. And one of the primary techniques for that is this sort of, I consider to be one of the more mysterious ones. And it's what Jung called active imagination. And it's this
Hmm.
technique where you somehow gain access to the unconscious mind, similar to if you were dreaming, but
Hmm.
you do it while awake. And so, like, and I'll be the first to admit I have not cracked this nut. Like, it's something I've played around with a little bit, but I don't feel like I've developed a really solid technique. But you
Mm.
told me the other day you've been having a lot of success and interesting experiences with it. So
Yeah, no, I'd love to talk about that. It's recently one of my favorite subjects as well. So, I mean, the way I view it, because we tend to overcomplicate some of these things, especially with Jung, because his work is so dense. But what's so surprising about something like active imagination is that it's actually one of the most natural facets and behaviors of the mind, because it's something that we used to do when we were kids.
yes, I was just thinking that. Yeah.
It's basically just a daydream. It's the fantasy function of the mind. It's the thing that happens when you're on a bus ride that's a little too long and you don't have anything to listen to or read and you stare out the window. It's that thing, the thing that starts to engage, that you're a daydream. But the difference and the twist that's happening in active imagination that makes it such a brilliant process that Jung intuited in his own discovery of it is that the daydream is turned in on itself. That rather than the external world being the subject, rather than just kind of a free association, flights of fancy thing, the daydream turns in on itself and you are the subject. And you gently kind of guide it along. In Jung's method, the one that he primarily used was mm, the visual of digging into dirt. And
Yeah.
as you do so, as the deeper you go, the more you kind of relinquish control of the daydream. And it just takes on a life of its own, and you meet certain objects or characters or scenarios. And that's really the way to view it. It's don't overcomplicate it with this idea that you need, advanced training, that you need to go to the Jungian Institute of New York City for a few years to do it, or that you need even a Jungian analyst at your disposal. It's just a type of daydream that you've turned in on itself.
Yeah. Really interesting. And I want to know more about. I'm familiar with this story that you told about how Jung, one of Jung's favorite ways to visualize it was digging.
Hmm.
And one of the interesting things about that that's left unsaid, at least in terms of like how I remember him talking about is this is actually the classical motif for gaining what the ancients considered to be uh, e- exoteric knowledge, or I guess esoteric knowledge from what they consider to be exoteric sources, like
Hmm.
meaning going down, like this word catabasis, which I'm sure you've heard. Like one of the
Hmm.
primary ways that like any like mystery traditions or these sort of sacred places where you would go have like a communion with a god or whatever would require you to go down into some kind of chamber.
Ooh,
And of
yeah.
course, there's also all of these catabasis stories, like um, Dante, stories of, different gods, goddesses, heroes going to the underworld,
Hmm.
which is a motif we've largely lost. Like now, if you're doing anything
Mm.
sacred, it's some kind of ascension. It's some kind of like
Mm.
going up. But there's something key and extremely, I think, native to the human experience that also needs to go down. And it's not,
Yeah.
and it is kind of dark. It is kind of unknown, scary, evocative of the underworld, but it's important. And I won't speculate too much on the importance now because I want to stick to active imagination. But do you do something similar? Do you do this sort of like digging visualization that Jung talked about, or what do you do?
Yeah. So, I mean, his great insight was this idea of taking the visual of digging. And in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he describes that process
Yeah.
of boring a tunnel into the ground as an archetypal experience.
Mm.
It's very interesting because he, of course, he most often is talking about these things he calls images, as these figures that end up blossoming into our myths and stories and culture. But there are also experiences that are archetypal, and the idea of going through a space, a confined space into the darkness, is an archetypal experience. And so it engages this part of your mind which interacts with the unconscious, and it's kind of a back door into it. But what I would associate it with, and I think this perhaps gives us a little clue as to the ancient nature of the unconscious and the bedrock of what it's built on,
Mm-hmm.
is that this visual of digging a tunnel or going through a shaft, descending down a ladder, which I use at times, it's the process of entering a cavern. It's the process that our ancient, distant ancestors knew very, very well. And that's an archetypal experience, entering a cave, one of these confined dark spaces
Yeah.
where the imagination exists because of that darkness, where cave paintings are made, where the flame from the fireplace that you build sets everything alive. It's
Mm-hmm.
that itself is an archetypal place.
Yeah, especially when you think about what are the oldest pieces of human art that we know of. They're all
Hmm.
like cave paintings. And I mean there's some obvious reasons for that, right? I mean, it's natural shelter, it's going to protect you from the elements. But if you look at, like there's that famous like bee shaman um image or whatever that looks super psychedelic and strange. Like clearly there's probably some shamanistic stuff, or what we today would call shamanistic stuff, going on in those places. Um, could be that it was just where they decided to capture the image, but I think there is probably something innate to the human psyche that correlates the physical act of going into darkness with entering some kind of psychical space.
Hmm.
And I mean, that's just speculation, but we can certainly see that more in more recent history. I mean, even the Hellenistic world is thousands of years ago at this point, but we have so many records of that, like I was alluding to before. So, so for you, it sounds like you do something similar. But for me, I guess the thing that I've struggled with when I try to do active imagination is the feeling of a sort of relinquishment of control, where
Hmm.
where I don't feel like I'm the one who's steering, in the same way that like for instance, when you read Inner Work by Robert Johnson, he talks a lot about actual methods for dream work, for active imagination. And when I'm having a dream or recalling a dream, I know for sure my conscious mind is not controlling that experience. If anything, the
Mm.
conscious mind is struggling to have any kind of grasp on whatever I just experienced. Um, but in active imagination, it's like I have trouble getting there most of the time. So
Mm.
how does that go for you? That sort of, is there a noticeable handoff where you reach this sort of, for lack of a better term, unconscious handoff, or
Sure. No,
how do you experience that? Yeah.
I get exactly what you're saying. So uh, I've had experience with it enough that I've created these guided meditations in my podcast feed for Creative Codex. So as you scroll down, you might see something labeled as a guided meditation. Half of those are this active imagination based method. One of the recent ones was Inner Child guided meditation, and that one doesn't use the digging, but instead uses what I referred to as the climbing down the ladder. So you recall your childhood home, you find your closet
Mm,
or a closet that you're familiar with, but inside of that closet you find a doorway or something that can open into a shaft, and you take that ladder down. And in the process of climbing also down, 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 down into the darkness, it's also this kind of engaging an archetypal into the cavern type experience. But what happens is, let's say if you do the digging one that Jung refers to in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the first few things you engage might not feel like they're happening to you. It might feel a little artificial. It might feel like you're dig, and you hit a tree root, and you're like thinking about tree roots, and it maybe causes you to think about this and that. And so far you're still very much leading it, let's say with your frontal lobes or something,
Yeah, yeah.
so then, but you continue digging every time there's a pause, or you hit something along the way that you either dislike, or you feel is artificial, or you feel doesn't have anything else for you. You just resume digging. That's the beauty of it. You just, wherever you are in the space of wherever you end up, you can always resume digging. And in the process of resuming digging, maybe the fourth time, maybe the fifth time, you haven't decided it, but you've relinquished control.
Hmm.
Maybe you've hit the bedrock, like Jung sometimes in one of the passages he describes, he hit the bedrock, which means he was digging for a while. He was probably
Right.
digging for 10 minutes of various things along the way that he ran into. But the more often you do it, the easier it is, or the sooner you relinquish that control. And the only control you end up having, though, you're not completely just watching a movie. The control you do end up still having is walking around in the environment, interacting with objects and things, and eventually, if you meet a figure of any kind, like Jung did in the Red Book, talking with them. And that's where it's vital to have some piece of paper on your lap or something, where you just jot down the most basic notes, basically, to then be able to recall and flesh out later.
Is that how you do it? Do you physically write, or do you have like a recording going or something, or what do you do?
Yeah, I'll have a few sheets of paper on my lap with a pen, and I just, when I sit down to begin, I just put the pen at the top left of the page, and then I have my eyes closed. So those pages are these end up being these beautiful, very scribbly sentences that look like a madman wrote them. Sometimes the sentences overlap when I'm not being perfect with
Yeah.
the penmanship. But that's the job of after the fact, then fleshing out some of that, and then writing it into like a dream journal, like I do, let's say. But I've done that even in the car. Like, let's say I had 30 minutes extra before work, a student canceled or something. And I'm like, yeah, let's do some work. Let's do some digging. And I'll just put some paper on my lap, lean back, and have at it. Set the alarm for 20 minutes, basically.
Cool. So what is it late? I guess there's two different ways that I want to make sure we cover in this. I'll just state them now so I don't forget. I want to hear about some of your experiences, because it sounds like this is a like somewhat recent thing. You've been having a lot of interesting or inspiring or informative
Well,
experiences.
I've just felt compelled lately to do that kind of work because, uh, in the absence of seeing a Jungian analyst,
Yeah.
this for me is providing some value and understanding of some of those spaces and figures that are whirling around and competing inside of me.
Yeah. And so I want to hear more about that. But two, also, there's this pernicious fact that exists just by virtue of the kind of lives that we're living, with obligations and need to make a living, and have, if we have family, you have a family, you have a kid to take care of. Like, there always is this lurking thing, I think, in the back of all of those people's minds, like, I don't have time for this, like, or I have time for like one thing. I could do like a meditation maybe. Why should I do this? Like, why should I specifically do active imagination? And that, just a quick sidebar, is I even find myself struggling with that as a person who
Hmm.
does. I have way more free time than most people, and knowing what practice I want to do, and then also even like trying to find a way to merge all these different practices sometimes is
Right.
challenging. Like, like do it, if you're doing some kind of meditation or ritual thing where you're like the imagination or the unconscious is really not coming into it at all. But then you're also interested in Jung, and the goals at first seem not the same, and trying
Hmm.
to merge all
Hmm.
that together can be tricky.
Yeah. I mean, if there's if there's anybody who understands being strapped for time, it's me. I have a 9-year-old daughter. I have a 9-month-old son. I have a roof over our heads that requires mortgage payments. I have roughly 3 part-time jobs. I
Oh,
have
wow.
this podcast that I work on, that I have to release a major narrative episode roughly once a month. I try to keep myself to that schedule. I have my creative pursuits, which I find incredible value in, playing piano, writing music, occasionally doing visual art. So I understand being strapped for time. I get it. But like I was saying, um, everybody can find those 20, 30 minutes
Yeah.
if it's meaningful enough to you. It's the difference between me, doom scrolling on Reddit, just for who knows, laughs or something, or being like, let me do some work. And it doesn't even have to be that I have my journal with me where I do the work. I do it on, if I've done it, sometimes it was on scraps of paper, and then later that night after everyone's asleep, I transcribe it. But the other thing about this kind of work that's really interesting and surprised me is that it's not as cerebral as it sounds. Once you start engaging, these figures inside of you, when you've done, a few of these active imaginations, and you're like, I'm ready to speak to somebody,
Mm.
I've seen enough objects, I've seen enough scenarios of places. Let me find somebody to speak to. And so, you can ask the space that you're in to guide you to something. Like the other day, I entered a space during one of these active imaginations. I'm like, where's my soul? I want to
Oh,
speak to
wow.
her. Let me find her. And I was funny enough in a cavern, and there was an altar with a cave bear skull on it, and there were this host of 20 or so cave people. I'm like, which way do I go to get to my soul? And they said, this way and that way. But in any case, the work becomes very emotional, because these figures are actual parts of yourself that are personified in these forms. And so afterward, let's say after you've done one of these, and you spoke to a part of yourself, and it felt meaningful, because it is. After a few days, you feel guilty for not going back and continuing the conversation, because now you're establishing a relationship, and
Yeah.
it can feel just as real as a conversation you have here between me and you, or somebody on the street. And who's to say this conversation is any more real than the one you have with the person inside of yourself? We're talking over, bleeps and bloops and ones and zeros that go across the span of the internet. So so what I'm trying to say is it becomes emotional work. And like, if you meet something like your inner child, and you hug them and it feels meaningful, after a few days you're like, I should visit him again. He's probably
Yeah.
feeling lonely. And that's a real aspect of the work. And then you find the time, basically.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's speaking about the reality or non-reality of it. It sort of just to me feels like a different thing, not necessarily more or less real. And I'm not giving people license to just incarnate all of their fantasies, to the highest possible priority and legitimacy. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, of course, Jung had some kind of like flowery Latin word for this. It might be like mysterium imaginum or something like that. But the idea is that when you start to enter the unconscious in this way using this lens, because
Mm-hmm.
if we really want to like start getting into mindfuck territory, e- everyone
Which
has
we
had
do.
the idea of, oh, maybe my senses are not accurately capturing whatever's going on in the outside world. Maybe I'm living in a highly reduced sort of human reality, right? And this is essentially what anybody who's spinning any kind of matrix simulation, or even more well thought out, scientifically rigorous folks like Dr. Donald Hoffman or Bernardo Kastrup or whatever. This is what even mainstream reductionist materialist cognitive science, from my understanding, is saying that you live in a very, very narrow bandwidth of reality,
Mm,
if it's reality at all.
mm,
Now let's use that same lens on what you're talking about. This is like one lens by which you can experience that world, like
mm,
whatever it's going on. And I'm not saying that makes it more or less real, but it shines a light on that there is this whole inner reality that we don't have any languages like at our ready disposal to enter there. And
Mm,
the ancients did, I think. And we wouldn't
right.
call them psychologists, we wouldn't call them Jungian analysts, we would call them like shamans or
Mm-hmm.
priests or you know,
Even witches.
hierophants, witches,
Yeah.
yeah, hierophants who like sat at the top of mystery traditions or whatever. But the point was is there were portals by which I I don't know. I'm yearning for something. I'm going to go to this established place for that. Now we don't even know what those things are, and there's because there's such a lack of fluency. There's a lot of dubious people claiming to hold entryway into that. You know,
Mm,
like new agey shaman and air quotes types and stuff like that. So let's just take seriously this idea that we do have this inner world that we have that requires some kind of catharsis, right? That like
mm,
by some way we need to figure out how to access this world. I think this is a really interesting method because it doesn't require you to believe anything. It doesn't
sure.
require any power holder. All it requires is for you to sit down by yourself and explore this space and capture whatever you come across. And to your point too, the latter point of you almost feel guilty for not doing it.
Mm,
I've experienced the same thing with my own practice where it's almost like you develop this apparatus or this like this valve for to let off some kind of steam where
mm-hmm.
before that steam was just building up and you weren't sure how to let that steam off. And then as you start a practice or a meditation or a ritual or some kind of inner inquiry, you start to realize, oh, this is an effective method for whatever that hunger is that I didn't
Mm,
even know was a mechanism by which to let that valve off. And it seems like it's that too. Like it's a way, it's some kind of psychological or psychospiritual apparatus that you develop. And you
yeah.
find that it has this really important cathartic function that you might not even know existed before.
Yeah. No, no, absolutely. I agree with all of that. And I'd like to mention this idea that you're referring to that, the ancients, as we'll call them, had a more of a vested interest in traveling into those inner spaces. There's the work of Henry Corbin, who writes about Sufism and mystic, the mystic corner of the Islamic tradition. And he terms that inner space that they engage with in these creative meditations mundus imaginalis. And he has some great
That's what
work
it
about
is.
this.
That
Yeah,
that
yeah,
must be what
that's
I was
maybe
trying
the
to think
Latin
of.
term, right? Yeah, and it's exactly the same thing. It's the engagement of an inner world through imagination. But in the case of something like the Sufis, they view this as spiritual work, because eventually what ends up happening, you go deep enough, you travel through enough worlds that you go through these various steps, they call them, which are these different planes. And they view it as spiritual work. We view it through the Jungian lens as psychological work. But at the same time, somebody like certain Jungian authors and analysts themselves, like Jeffrey Raff, who wrote the book Jung and the Alchemical Imagination. He claims that active imagination is Jung's method for the transmutation of the soul. So here's somebody, who's a trained Jungian analyst who writes and understands the importance of alchemy and active imagination, and he doesn't mince any words. He brings the soul right into it, and I think there's something to that. Yeah,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We got to get into that sort of psychospiritual alchemy in this conversation too because it's we talked about alchemy last time but it's, you can't exhaust that one. You definitely can't exhaust that one. But
true.
what ended up happening in your imagination while you were looking for your soul and what did you find in that? I got to know.
I'll share. I'll share. It's obviously private. I mean,
Yeah.
how much more private can that be
Yeah,
than?
that's pretty. Yeah, I understand. I understand.
But I'll share it. I'll share it in the guise of hopefully encouraging others to engage with this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So the short of it is after. Some of them blend together though because I've done it multiple times where I met the soul, but the aspect of it there after those cave people told me, go down this passageway, which I followed and went down. It exited out onto a beach, and it was suddenly a very bright, clear sky, and there was, some. While you're doing this, it's important to kind of think about what does this feel like, uh, what other senses can you engage during this process, because the more sensory information that you kind of overload your mind with, again, the more you relinquish control. So you're like, what does the sand feel like under my feet? Is the air cold? What is the color of the sky? So as you're in these spaces, that's fill it with information, or just allow yourself to notice what that information is. So I'm walking on these sand dunes, and then in the distance I see a robed figure, and I'm like, yeah, there she is. That's my soul. And as I approached closer, I saw that she had this kind of henna-like design on her hands, and that's really all I could see. I couldn't really see her face under the hood, but then we had a little conversation, and I wrote it down, and it was meaningful experience. It was very interesting. And then I asked her, what kind of work is there to be done, and again, I'm giving too much information away, and I don't want to taint anybody else's experience. That's the other thing. But in the interest of science, I'll mention. She said that this figure called the Hooded One, which to me represents my shadow and my shadow aspect, that he wanted to make a deal and that there was some work to be done there. And so that kind of planted a seed for future ensuing, active imagination experiences to go meet that guy, basically.
So interesting. Yeah, I think a lot of people listening are going to generally understand these sort of well-established pieces of the psyche that we're referring to here. But just to zoom it out a little bit for people that aren't familiar, Jung introduced several sort of core archetypes by which or through which you sort of need to encounter in some way during your individuation process, as he called it, this journey toward wholeness, this journey toward capital S self or soul discovery, and really understanding who you are as an individual in your totality, light and dark, everything fully integrated. And one that probably everyone has heard of, which is sort of like usually talked about as the first encounter, is the shadow. And you can incarnate the shadow, obviously, as this sort of like dark figure, very similar to how it was referred to in your active imagination. But you can also largely think of the shadow as the sort of entire unknown region of the unconscious that you haven't explored. So, popular writers on this and analysts on this will say, like, there's gold in your shadow too. There's strengths in your shadow. There's like hidden talents, all these other things. And that sounds paradoxical, but the reason it makes sense is because it can largely be anything that you haven't realized. It can largely be any part of your psyche that you have either repressed or haven't discovered or whatever.
Yeah.
But then beyond that, there's the anima animus, which generally, if you're male, it's said that you have an anima that's sort of like the representative of the soul, and it's this female archetype. If you're and vice versa, if you're female, you have this male figure called the animus, and that figure is often correlated with the soul, as MJ is alluding to here. So I have long wanted to have an anima encounter, and I've definitely had some dreams where I feel like perhaps that's what it was. But I often wonder as well how else this same sort of archetype can manifest itself, because this is one of the you mentioned tainting people's experience. The inner landscape is so strange and psychedelic and oceanic, and the way that it can present is so vast, and we
Yeah.
sort of lose touch with how vast it can be in waking consciousness, because things always present in the same way, right? But then you go to sleep, and if you get, like, especially if you get jolted out of sleep, you can find
Mhm.
yourself in some incredibly fractal, strange DMT, like psychedelic echo of whatever you were just in. If you
Sure.
and what's funny is I've brought this up to uh family members randomly, like, hey, have you experienced this? And I'll purposely bring it up to family members that I know have not taken psychedelics or
Right.
whatever, just to see if they kind of know what I'm
Right.
talking about. And oddly, many of them don't have a single memory of this ever happening to them.
Mm.
But t- I don't know, maybe it's just like an orientation where they just don't ever think about this stuff, and they don't, as soon as they wake up, they start getting preoccupied with whatever's going on.
Yeah, it's easy to lose that thread
Yeah,
very
but for
quickly, very
me,
quickly.
like if I get roused out of sleep, it's like that sort of mind's eye, sort of crazy fractal stuff going on. So it's
Sure.
like that's the unconscious can present like flowing sacred geometry. It can present like fully constructed worlds. It can reference things that happened to you that day. It can reference things that you have no fucking idea what it's referencing.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I'm just opening up this can of worms to say that if people are feeling frustrated with whatever they're experiencing, or what they're experiencing is not following this whole schema laid out by Jung, I don't think there's anything wrong with you. I think this is one way by which things can present. And I do think that it's a good route to pursue, because it's giving you something conceptual that you can actually bring back to the conscious, because that's the problem with when it does present in these really nebulous ways. It's just like
Mhm.
I don't know what this is or how to deal with it. I've been having this
Right.
issue in my own, capturing my own dreams lately, of like feeling like I'm in the midst of some very profound dream, and I'll go to like capture it because it's my morning thing. I always immediately write down whatever I remember, and I'll get to it
Mhm.
and I'll be like, I don't know even how to capture this. Like, and then as soon as I start trying to analyze it, it's just like I can't capture it. Um, but sticking with this more Jungian way of exploring the psyche, what do you think this, now in your experience, having had what you can pretty solidly say, like, yes, this is an anima encounter,
Mm.
how has it altered your understanding of your psyche? And like, what do you think is like like next, so to speak?
There's a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, because once you encounter one of these figures, it's not like, great, I can go back to I could go back
Yeah.
to the horrible life and habits that I had before. Let me pick up, smoking and drinking some more again. It's like, well, now you have a responsibility laid out in your lap, and it's like, you have no excuses at that point,
Yeah.
right? And I think maybe perhaps that scares some people unconsciously away from some of these experiences, because once you start acknowledging that your inner world is valuable, you have no more excuses, right? Because if your inner world is valuable, then what are you wasting all your time on, with all this other stuff you do in life? And so there's that aspect of it too. We sometimes deceive ourselves a little bit, perhaps. But yeah, now there's always going to be work to do, but it's a beautiful thing. I mean, personally, as an artist, I find tremendous value, in all this stuff, because at the same time that it's feeding you emotionally, and you're developing, psychologically, by addressing your various issues. It also feeds you really interesting ideas and visuals and symbols of its own, and you start to make sense of yourself, but also of the architecture of the mind. And occasionally, a symbol is so striking that you need to put it into some kind of visual art or poem, And that kind of brings to mind, that Jung was doing all this stuff himself throughout
Yeah.
his entire life. And I think we need to reframe our understanding of Jung, that he wasn't just a psychologist, he was a creative genius.
Yes.
He So I wasn't going to say that he was also a mystic. You could go down that route, but he, in this book, like let's say The Art of C.G. Jung, which was only released 5 years ago, that we're starting to acknowledge that he was incredibly active, even outside of the Red Book, creating paintings, sculptures, um, all kinds of illustrations that he never wanted to get credit for. This was just his own personal pursuit. So the president of one of the Jung foundations, who writes a foreword for the book, he calls Jung an exceptionally creative man. And one wonderful quote from Memories, Dreams, Reflections that kind of illustrates this. Jung says, he mentions the idea of working with sculpture and with natural tools. He says, building with pebbles and clay was just the beginning. It released a stream of fantasies, which I later carefully transcribed. Whenever I got stuck later in life, I always painted a picture or worked with stone. Everything that I have written this year grew out of the work with stone that I did after my wife died. So throughout his entire life, as he was doing his own personal, inner work, occasionally a symbol or a scenario would present itself to him, and he would create art out of that, to help understand it. If he couldn't analyze it, there's something about externalizing it into a work of art that helps
Yes.
you process it a bit more.
Yes.
And so there's that aspect we should, always remember, or maybe shine more light on these days.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're reminding me too that in Inner Work by Robert Johnson, famous Jungian analyst and author, the fourth step in his sort of dream work prescription, which is the fourth and final step, is ritual. And
Mhm.
what you're talking about could be viewed as that step. Like everything that, like, let's be clear. Jung was a sort of the initiator of this whole stream of thinking. Johnson comes later, but Johnson did a good job of like trying to actually formalize some of the things that with Jung were like a lot more sprawling and nebulous.
Yeah.
And he, I love his four steps to dream work. And you're pointing to the importance of what is the most difficult to understand step, which is ritual. And
Mm.
essentially the idea is, just to speed run through the four things. It's you capture a dream image, you create associations about what you associate with that image. Then you look at the dynamics of how what you've captured applies to your own inner life, and then you interpret the dream largely and look for the meaning once you've created those, once you've identified the associations and dynamics. But then the
Right.
fourth step is you do something in the physical world to sort of close the loop on or
Mhm.
act on whatever wisdom you received from the dream. And sometimes it's very straightforward. Like if you feel, if you realize, oh, this dream is about a person I've wronged, you don't do something esoteric, you rectify the wrong that you did. And then that brings
Mm.
some kind of compensation to that, whatever that unconscious need was. But sometimes it's way more nebulous and you're not sure what to do about it. And I
Mhm.
think creating a piece of art would be a fantastic way to do that. And clearly
Right.
that's what Jung was doing a lot of the time. Is like, yes, he was trying to capture these, if you look at the art in the Red Book, for instance, like, yes, he's trying to capture these figures, he's trying to solidify these figures in some way, but also he's a human and he's going through, grief in that example you gave, or he's struggling with different philosophical ideas. And sometimes you can't address those ideas intellectually. You have to
Mhm.
figure out
Right.
some kind of indirect or subjective way, subjectively objective way, I guess, to
Right.
bring them into the world. And art can be like really just the intention of deciding like this piece of art is for this, or something as like this walk is for this, or this um you know meditation is for this, like that. There's strange power in that you don't begin to feel unless you start doing it.
Totally. Totally. I mean, there's also the whole issue that how much of creativity, genius, and such is just neural
Yeah,
pathways,
yeah.
interacting in a complicated way, and how much of it is how the ancient peoples viewed it. How much of it is this concept of the daimon, or the genius of someone, um, which is more rather than an idea of a choreography of neurons. Instead, it's a collaborative effort between this point of consciousness, which is you, and these unseen forces of the universe. Because there are countless examples, in the literature of creative geniuses, for example, where the idea or the inspiration comes swiftly, occasionally
Yes.
fully formed, and it can feel like it's attacking you. It's saying, if you don't grab me and do something with this, I'm going to go on to the next person who will, because it comes in with certain force at times. So there are examples, let's say, of like even in non-creative fields. There's the example of Frederick Kekule, the chemist, who
Oh,
who
yeah.
had the problem of trying to visualize what benzene looked like chemically, and he had a dream where he was seeing geometric shapes, and then he saw an Ouroboros biting its tail, and when he woke up, he realized that benzene forms a ring. It's the benzene ring. And this was a tremendous kind of flash for him. I think I have, yeah, he wrote, this would happen in 1864. And so afterward, he kind of wrote down, but look, what was that? One of the snakes had seized hold of its own tail, and the form whirled mockingly before my eyes. Then, as if by a flash of lightning, I awoke. So this is a guy, he's not even making artworks, related to,
Hmm.
a creative medium. Something is coming to him in a flash, and what is that?
Right.
We can definitely say that it's some kind of unseen forces.
Yeah. Yeah, try capturing that in the schema of dreams are just some kind of, cleaning process the brain is doing, and there are these weird epiphenomenal images that don't mean anything. It's nonsense. You're just attaching meaning to a like try attaching that to humongous insights like that, and I guess if you're super committed to that worldview, you can find a way to do that.
Sure.
But I'm extremely, I think the more you go down the rabbit hole of what is possible to personally perceive in the labyrinth of your own psyche, the more these ideas of inside and outside sort of just continuously get turned inside out on one another.
Hmm.
And I really think that at best, you can sort of arrive at this place of I just don't know. Like it could
Hmm.
be coming from inside, it could be coming from outside, and at the very I cannot dismiss that there is a permeability here that I don't understand. That there are immaterial things, that we have not yet captured on our scientific instruments that could be appearing to me in the form of insights or in the form of bad dreams or in the form of whatever it is. And this very much, Jung, to keep him as the through line, this is something that he talked about in a multitude of ways. And just to regurgitate a quote that I've said so many times on the show, there's that line in the Red Book from Philemon, another archetype that we haven't directly spoke about yet, the wise old man or Senex
Yeah.
archetype,
Right.
where he tells Jung, you think ideas are yours, but they're more like birds in the sky or animals in the forest, or whatever the I don't remember the exact quote, but it's something to that effect. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
at the very like I keep saying, at the very least, it becomes this thing that you can't deny, you can't disprove that it's somehow all in your head or whatever it is. Because
Right.
let's not even lose sight of the fact that we still don't even know what consciousness is. We still have no idea like exactly what role the brain is playing in consciousness, where it's coming from, how it's working. So why
Right.
would you dismiss that? Why wouldn't you look for insight in these more ancient ways of thinking about uh, extra local presences that are not strictly yours.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as time has gone on, it seems that we've narrowed the the potential size of our consciousness to just being inside of our body, that and how it interacts with the environment. I mean, the further into the past you look, the more that you see traditions interpreting these kinds of influences from the environment, and whether those are protective or guiding influences or even negative influences, as just aspects, like in the case of a genius, from ancient Rome. This would be thought of as a divine emanation that uh, could be anything from a personal genius that someone is born with and carries with them through their entire life, that influences them, that their creative work is created through, in a sense, to the genius of a place, the genius of a house, the genius of a city, this kind of
Yeah.
guiding spirit or protective spirit, and even the genius of a clan. And this was actually the way that eventually we started in after Rome to revere and see kings and the lines of kings as divine and worthy of worship themselves, because it started um, as paying reverence to the genius of this clan of the emperor, like of his family. And so that's where it started, and the roots are there. And that, of course, goes back into the daemon in ancient Greece, and even other cultures, like in Slavic native faith. It's believed that everyone is born with something called a dola, which is also this kind of guiding spirit, and that spirit has certain
Mm.
traits, the way that, in a role playing game, you have your stat
Mhm. Yeah,
list,
yeah.
and that dola might have a gift of skill in archery, and that person, notices that, oh, I'm actually much better at archery than Bob. I don't know why, but it's more natural for me. And so in Slavic native faith, the idea would be that, well, your dola, what you were born with, it has a skill in that direction. And one of your goals as an individual is to figure out what your dola is intending to
Wow.
do and is intended for. And so these ancient traditions had this more of a, you could say holistic, but not necessarily, I think, interweaved understanding between your point of consciousness and your individual sense and the environment and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah, that is remarkably similar to the sort of, Hellenistic Platonic scenario that's outlined in Plato's Republic, the book of or
Mm,
the myth of Ur, and then I've talked so much about Soul's Code by James Hillman, but James Hillman, in his, he's another Jungian analyst and author, um, also founder of archetypal psychology, but he talks about essentially an extremely similar situation, which was, he says, is directly inspired by the myth of Ur, and then he uses this analogy of
mm,
the acorn um, has the innate potential to become the oak tree, right?
right,
So, like
right.
that, in the same way that you're talking about, that one is sort of born with these latent abilities that sort of make themselves known, like not just abilities, but traits, weaknesses. The what makes the totality of you is somehow already there, and life is really more of a discovery process and a process of figuring out how to wield that, and either really settling into it and focusing on expressing and developing those unique talents, or sort of just letting the world, you know eat you, and you are prevented from
Mm,
ever sort of realizing your true potential. And yeah,
right.
it's wild because I've personally done you know what I think is a lot of research on this idea of the daimon, or the genius, and I know of very, like, many examples, and the one you just told me is one I have not heard. So
The
there's
dola, right.
yes, there's so many examples of this that, once again, you have to either at the very least admit that there's something innate in the human psyche that comes up with this over and over again,
Mm,
or that there really is something to it, and perhaps these myths don't fully capture it, but they're speaking about something that is true and innate to the human experience, and perhaps like ontologically real in some way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what's fascinating is if we go into this topic of creative genius. So I've been studying creative geniuses for the last 5 years as part of what I do on the show, and you end up seeing a lot of the same traits recurring between these figures, that span obviously centuries of human civilization and cultures although all the varied environments and such. So you look at somebody like, let's say, Vincent van Gogh, and Vincent, as I know him, because you get quite close with some of these people when you spend time with them. He was he was working as an art curator in a gallery for a number of years once he was old enough to have a job, but it just wasn't working out for him. Something there, his personality didn't mesh well with the people he was with, and eventually he was let go from that position. Then he goes into another line of interest, which is to become a priest, and he dedicates himself so much to it that he wants to become a monk. But the problem is the local orders of the church, they aren't so keen on him taking this position, because the one responsibility he's been given so far in this small local town, he's relinquished his material possessions, and he's even let homeless people sleep in the dwelling that the church has paid for him to sleep in, and he chooses to go sleep on the hay in the barn. So they kind of say, we're not really too keen on what you're doing over here. We think we're going to demote you and not promote you. And so his brother Theo starts to see, the difficulties that Vincent is having with his life, and he instead encourages him to try maybe to pick up painting, because he's always been very artistic, but he hasn't really pursued it much. I mean, he was working as a curator and trying to sell works and such, so he knows the business. So he takes his brother up on this offer of that his brother will pay for his basic, amenities and livelihood, just so he can focus on painting. And he does. And from that moment until 10 years later, he paints 900 paintings.
Wow.
Which to this day, in modern times, are considered the most valuable collection of artwork in the world, in the billions of dollars.
Wow.
And we can say, what is that? He was already in his late 20s when he picked up the paintbrush. And the amount of energy and passion he dedicates to this task, despite having no guarantee that it'll work, it shows that it taps into something.
Yes.
Right? It opened up some kind of locked, closed door inside of him. And I think we all have these kinds of doors. And sometimes what it takes is somebody just saying, give it a try. You seem like, you used to do art, but what happened? You got, focused on all the distractions of the world and such.
Yeah.
So that's one of the inspiring things about the story of Vincent van Gogh, is this idea that out of nowhere, just right out the gate, the chance is presented to him, and all he does for 10 years is paint 900 paintings.
Yeah, it's incredible. And stories like that, too, are just such great illustrations of this strange phenomenon that we're alluding to, that it seems as if there is some preordained talent or presence or whatever that's just waiting for you to acknowledge it. And what's so interesting is, yes, society does a lot to dissuade people from going down these pathways just innately by trying to shove you into various boxes, having to go to school, having to provide for a family, having to, try to work your way up the ladder at whatever job you're doing. And those are all very real points of resistance. But strangely, people prevent themselves a lot of the time. Like they don't want to believe that this thing that's calling out inside of them isn't, like, they're like, oh, that's just, I don't know. We do all kinds of weird mental contortions to sort of diminish it or pretend that we're not worthy of doing that thing. And
yeah,
But to your point, like sometimes when you let that to use the valve analogy again, you let that valve off, and it's just like an incredible geyser of energy just erupts from there,
Mm-hmm.
and you just can't stop, and suddenly it's this thing that you clearly, from all outside perspectives, people would be like, you're meant to do this. This is the thing that you are meant to do. And I don't want to give anybody the false hope that like, oh yeah, as soon as I start this thing, I'm going to be Vincent Van Gogh, or I'm going to be the greatest podcaster, or I'm going to be the greatest whatever. But I can promise you that if you don't do it, you definitely won't be. You definitely won't come even close to finding out what your potential is, and where you can go with it. And I on this note, I do think it's important to say that for whatever strange, cruel, twist of fate reason, there actually are some people whose fate seems to be like a tragic one. Like
Sure.
they
It's almost like
follow.
unavoidable. Yeah.
Yeah, like they follow whatever that is to the very, very end, and it leads to some really sad place. That seems to be a thing too, unfortunately. So this keeps the idea of the daimon, or fate, or destiny, or the gods sometimes having some kind of strange, twisted, cruel sense of humor about people, tricks, or at the very least very trickstery. It's like, oh, you want to be an artist, eh? Well, you'll be an artist after you die. Everyone will think your art is great, but while you're alive, it's just going to be like, I can't think of an example of artists like that, but there have been many.
Well, Vincent
Obviously.
Van Gogh is one
Right?
of these.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
he
There you
he
go.
sold one painting from those 900, but he still kept going. That's
Yeah.
that's I think the lesson there, and why his story continues to be so captivating to people all worldwide in all cultures, is that he tapped into something, right? And whether you dedicate all of your energy to it or not, I think is besides the point. The point being that you give yourself the time to do that thing, and
Yeah.
you find incredible value from it. So one personal reflection related to this would be that I went to an art high school. I was doing a lot of oil painting at the time, and then after, I ended up pursuing music, and I went to college to do music composition and music for film. And I put visual art pretty much on the back burner, and then even just forgot about it entirely. Forget about painting, like
Mm-hmm.
that's what I did in high school. And about a weird thing happened. I mean, a tragic thing happened. One of my closest friends passed away just suddenly, uh, 2.5 years ago, and and his wife afterward, because he painted. She asked me to. She said that, well, James thought of you as a great artist, and he has this painting that was meant for me. That
Wow.
it's a painting of Persephone,
Wow.
and he was working on it, but it's not finished. Do you think you'd be able to finish it for him? And first I said yes, and then second I thought, I haven't painted since high school, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And but there was still that part of me that still existed, and so I basically had to relearn how to paint because of it, because I wanted to work on this for my friend and for his wife. It's very meaningful, obviously, super meaningful. And so it's very emotional. And after I finished it, I considered, well, should I keep painting? I've started this, and it took about a year to do the painting because I didn't know what I was doing. But I had this dream where, going back to what you say, like one of these anima experiences, where I was on the grounds of some large mansion, but I was like kind of in the garden. It was a very lush garden,
Mm.
and there was a painting on a stand in front of me, and it was a painting of the landscape. And I was in front of it, and I was like half working on it, and um, and then a figure appeared of just a beautiful woman, a beautiful maiden, and she basically, I think she was sorry, it was a while since I looked at the notes of this, but she was the one that was painting, and she handed me the brush, and then I continued the painting, and then basically afterward, I picked up painting again, and it
Wow.
felt very meaningful, and I continued that, and I have a painting I'm working on right now. It's just every once in a while, maybe once a month when there's some time, I work on it.
That's an amazing story, man. I want to see that painting. That sounds amazing. And I'm sure you had to have considered how oddly synchronistic that it is that of all things, this was a painting of Persephone. That's like a figure that resides in the underworld and like can come out of the underworld and somehow is like transcending the border of living and dying. And this weird handoff of like someone dying and then someone living finishing that image, like that's archetypally very, very interesting.
Yeah, there were many nights where I was reflecting on exactly that, and yeah, the depth of symbolism of that, and it was a very meaningful experience in that regard. It was also a very frustrating experience because, again, I wanted to do a good job,
Right.
and
I'd be so worried about fucking it up. I'd like the only thing that could change this from an amazing, inspiring story is me just, you know, like that terrible piece of like art restoration where like I
yeah,
forget, was
right.
it? Yeah, where
It
the
was a
face is
Virgin
just,
Mary,
yeah, yeah,
I think, or Jesus.
right.
I think it was a Jesus
Yeah, I think it
painting
was. Yeah,
for
yeah.
a cathedral.
I'll flash that up
Yeah,
on the screen. Yeah, yeah. You're like, I did it, and it's like, oh no. Yeah,
no, no, no. Well, when it wasn't completely, terrifying, then there were moments where it was like, wow, this is so natural for me to be doing this, and it feels so rewarding for many reasons. But when it wasn't those two things, it was very very thoughtful, and gave me a lot to reflect on.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's recount. Let's try to just do an unbutchered recounting of the main Persephone story for people if they're like, what are you talking about? Um, so Persephone is the daughter of this nature goddess Demeter, and she is kidnapped by Hades basically and brought to the underworld and like made to be his wife and all this stuff. And various things happen. She ends up getting stuck there, but Demeter, her mother, is just searching for her and searching for her and searching for her and trying to like figure out how to get her back.
Well, yeah, the key
And
element also of her getting stuck in
the
Hades.
pomegranate, yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
were you getting to that? Sorry.
Well, yeah, go ahead. No,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, that Hades, drags her down, as she was frolicking in the flowers, and specifically, it's meant in some accounts it's narcissus flowers, and she is tricked by Hades through the offering of a pomegranate, and so she eats 6 of the seeds, and he tells her that you can't consume anything from the underworld. If you do, then you'll be trapped here. And but the deal is arranged that once Demeter finds out and she comes down and such, that she will be allowed out of the underworld for 6 months out of the year, and will have to stay in it for 6 months. And this is kind of also theorized to be the cycle of the seasons, that it
Yep.
represents that.
Right. And this is also the founding myth of Eleusis, of the Eleusinian mysteries. And that's
Yeah.
why Eleusis was founded where it was founded, is this is supposedly where Demeter showed up, and she was extremely just uh, fatigued and, just almost passing out basically. And some people there helped her and like gave her some, rest and food and water and whatever. And then she revealed herself to be a goddess. And then the tale is that she made those people the first priests and like taught them the mysteries or whatever, and then
Yeah.
the temple was built there. And
It's a beautiful tradition.
yeah,
Incredible.
I
So rich.
I so wish it still stood. I so wish that place still stood. I
Thank you,
definitely,
Christianity.
right, yeah. But a lot of those temples dilapidated to under just natural disrepair and circumstances, and I'm sure some of them were like reappropriated as Christian, but yet I mean, obviously in that part of the world it was just so tumultuous for so long. Who knows if any of these places would be standing even without the church persecution. But yeah, there's a whole other road I was thinking about going down in this whole ancient wonder dip sort of thread. But have we thoroughly explored all of the active imagination sort of angles that you wanted to get into? Because we did sort of talk about art and the role of art in Jung's active imagination, but are you sensing a potential link between your personal art and active imagination as well? Like, do you have any desire to incarnate any of these figures through art?
Yeah, of course. No, the pull is always there. But the thing that I wanted to touch on, perhaps we can, regarding how all of this ties into this idea that Jung is a creative genius,
Yeah.
and why does he realize these things when all these other psychologists of his time have no conception of? I think it's because there's certain traits, certain qualities of creative geniuses that you could describe as personality traits that arise, and you can see it from looking at Nikola Tesla to Frida
Mhm.
Kahlo to looking at the life and the mind of Jimi Hendrix and comparing that with Emily Dickinson, and you start to get a list of factors that they all share. So one of these is what I can say in terms of, let's say, Carl Jung, is a high degree of emotional intelligence and intrapersonal intelligence.
Mm.
So that's the intrapersonal not being interpersonal, but being the reference of intelligence of what's happening inside of you, of the workings of your mind, of your emotional world, and in this case of your inner world, and the idea that that's an important thing to understand, right?
Yeah.
So if you already start with that, then you're already a person more likely to, in the midst of a existential breakdown, say, well, let me see what's going on in there, because I'm relatively familiar with that area,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I can perhaps manage it, right? So that's the idea of after Jung has these uh, visions when he's having his existential crisis, he decides to sit down at night and try to figure them out, and obviously the digging method and such, and the rest is history. But there's also other factors that come into play. The idea of being a high creative, and
Yeah.
that's somebody who feels not only a compulsion to create art, but experiences a tremendous amount of value from that experience.
Right.
So a high creative is not only somebody who can go to the museum every day, but finds the idea of creating a piece of music, a work of a painting, writing a poem, equally and sometimes even more valuable than anything else they can be doing out in the world.
Yeah.
And often that's solitary work. And so somebody like Jung, you see his creative output in a book like The Art of C.G. Jung, and you start to realize, like, oh, he was very likely a high creative that was just coincidentally was on the path of being a psychologist.
Yeah.
And so there's all these fascinating other elements in his story that line up with all these other figures. I think we should see, and I personally see Jung as the Nikola Tesla of psychology.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. If we want to incarnate genius or daimon as these beings that almost inhabit you or inspire you in this way, what are some of the things you could do to make yourself attractive to them, right? And one of the things would be is that you have a multitude of ways to express yourself well. And
Mm.
Jung, as you're pointing to, was just an incredibly prolific creator. He was like his body of work of writing is fucking enormous.
Yeah,
He's as you've pointed to,
it's
he's got all of
intimidating.
these paintings. He's created sculptures. He built a tower. Like he was teaching, like, he was constantly, like, his whole life was poured into this act of output. And if you put yourself in the place of a creative genius, what would be more attractive than that, right? I mean, you'd want to express something through a conduit like this. And not only that, but he had this like this sacred longing kind of orientation that's very clear from
Hmm.
reading a lot of his work, you know, especially the Red Book. I mean, literally like these like poetic passages about like calling out to his soul and um,
Hmm.
you know, that's like almost like the prime candidate for creative genius to want to express itself through. So that's another way of thinking about this. And you know, that if you look at this stuff again from the ancient perspective or even from a modern esoteric perspective, they all agree that you've got to do certain things to cleanse yourself, to sort of, or even mainstream religion, right? Like fasting and,
Hmm.
you know, giving things up. Like these are still understood to be things that spiritually matter. They're like some kind of strange
Hmm.
spiritual currency or sacrifice that one needs to take part in order to, you know, whatever you think is going to happen. Whether it's receive inspiration or blessing or whatever. And it almost seems like in a lot of ways Jung's entire life was about that, you know.
Hmm.
And
Right.
maybe that's overstating and that's from the outside looking in and not knowing this person personally, but a lot of
Hmm.
these people seem like that. Like they were doing something special to like prime this signal. But I want to also just mention too that, you know, circling back on the sort of more tragic kind of creative that never becomes successful in their own day. You
Hmm.
touched on something that I think is really important is another reason why those people were able to stay the course despite maybe not being conventionally successful is because of what today in psychological terms we would call intrinsic motivation, is that
Hmm.
you discover this wellspring of motivation that comes from the inside, that comes in the form of positive emotion, positive affect, like I was saying before, feeling like you're doing something cathartic and positive with your creative output that doesn't require extrinsic motivation and extrinsic people patting you on the back and telling you you're doing a good
Right.
job or giving you lots of money, because you're generating that from the inside out. And at that
Hmm.
point, if you're able to do that, you'll do anything to continue that process and you won't really care about the external um, you know, validation that a lot of people are obsessed with. And I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of importance in that, is trying to sincerely explore or just ask yourself right now, if you're listening to this, where am I getting intrinsic motivation? What is it that makes me feel good? What is it that makes me feel motivated? What is it that makes me
Hmm.
feel like I want to do this for its own sake and that rewards me in some kind of measurable way? Because if you can discover that about yourself, like what intrinsically motivates you, you know, you look at an entrepreneur or an artist that's putting in so much time and work and you're like, man, how can they do that? And it's like because they're motivated, they're intrinsically motivated by it
Right.
in a
Right.
way that most people have not found. So to everyone
Yeah.
else, it looks strange and almost otherworldly, or like they're a workaholic or something. And maybe they are, but there's a good chance they've found some source of like inexhaustible intrinsic
Hmm.
motivation, and now they're just in that thing.
Yeah. No. No. Absolutely. There's something to be said for that things look different from the exterior, right? And there's all these things going on in that person's inner life that we can't see. Uh, to be reductionist about it, I think that should be stated though. There's an element of a dopamine fix
Mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm,
you get from creating works of art, and we could argue that people who find this kind of intrinsic motivation, or people who are creative geniuses, that dopamine fix that they get is higher and more concentrated than the one maybe an average person gets. Or if you're doing a task that maybe your dola or your genius or your sheet isn't already directed toward, right?
mm-hmm.
So I know this from just some students that I teach music. I teach piano and guitar, and occasionally a student comes along where they don't even need me. They don't even need a teacher. And this is rare, but you could tell that that list of personality traits is so geared toward doing something with music that it just has a life of its own. And though if they had no other resources and their parents didn't have money to pay for lessons, they would just study stuff from watching YouTube and figuring it out by ear. And it's really remarkable to see. And then, of course, when you see this kind of person, reach the heights of performing in Carnegie Hall in solo shows, we assume like, wow, who were their teachers? They must have had some crazy and expensive teachers. But the reality of it is, they'd still end up there even without teachers, because they're just so geared and wired for a certain thing, and the discovery of that thing just it opens it up like this acorn.
Yeah. There it is.
Yeah, I got this acorn from the grounds of Emily Dickinson's house in Amherst in Massachusetts. Don't tell them I took it, but there on those grounds, there is in front of her house a massive white oak tree that's it towers over everything. It's enormous, this thing. And just to think that started, as this tiny fingernail-sized acorn. That's all this is potential, right?
Yeah.
All this is a map for something that will outlast, centuries of people. And it's kind of nuts to think about that hidden potential being there.
I think the acorn threw me off because I started thinking about the James Hillman thing again. But like just before that, I had a complete, I had something I was going to go straight into that was like perfectly connected to what we were talking about.
We were talking about the genius and about the idea of finding that thing in your life.
It's mystery son of a bitch. Yeah, the mystery of why the trickster had to come pluck that right out of my head at the perfect time.
Yeah, no, see the ideas aren't yours. They just sweep through us. And if there's a wonderful talk by the author Elizabeth Gilbert, famously the author of Eat, Pray, Love. And you can look it up. It's on YouTube. It's a TED Talk. So good. I think it's called The Elusiveness of Your Creative Genius. And she talks about a poet that she met who describes her creative inspiration. So this poet would often work in the field on a farm, and that she could sense a poem coming from the other side of the field, like that it was sweeping in on her. And in those moments when that she saw the poem or felt that poem approaching, she would drop everything she was doing and run home, trying to outrun this poem. And that she would get through the door, get to her paper and pen, and that poem would hit her, and then she would start writing. And then at times, that poem just slightly missed her, that she didn't get there in time, but she was able to grab the poem by the tail and write the poem in reverse.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, so I remembered what I was going to say now is and it also fits in perfectly with this, is that these kinds of people that you're describing that you teach, and they come to you and you discover they don't even need a teacher. Like they already have that thing. I grew up playing in bands. So, you see the whole range of types of people, right? Like this person wants to do it for the attention. This person has some level of talent and they're just creative. But then there's those more rare people who are like, oh, this is their thing. Like they are uniquely talented with the guitar, with this, and they're going to do it in the bedroom for hours and hours, regardless of what the outcome is. Like they're always going to do this. Or they're going to find some other conduit that fits it even better. Like that's another thing that happens sometimes is like kind of like with you, you're just you grew up painting and then you just for whatever reason took to music, and then that became your core way to express yourself. And but yeah, there are certain people that you just sense like they have that burning creative need, and everything else is just something they have to do. But at the core, there's this weird thing, and I think it's weird because in my own case, I still love music and still have a desire to play music and write music all the time, and I'm a serial non-finisher of music and like riff writing and like songwriting and
Sure, it's
stuff.
a common thing.
Yeah. And I did much better when I actually was actively in a band and we had like, we had to finish
The
things,
structure,
then I would do it. But yeah, now I just have been like sitting on a pile of riffs and stuff for a long time. But anyway, for me, I think what it is a more amorphous need to do something creative that's speaking to these deeper questions, needs, because even when I'm doing something with music, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm like, if it's not evoking that like soul stirring feeling in me, I don't care. It's not that interesting. Like maybe it'll be something that, is like, wow, these riffs are just so cool. And like, I love the musicianship and that will have its place. Like maybe I'll want to listen to something like that at the gym that just gets me like fired up. But the stuff that I keep coming back to is what gives me that feeling, is what gives me that like same sense of awe and wonder and, maybe even like existential longing or whatever. Like this is why I was telling you got to listen to the Sleep Token band last night, because for me, they're like one of these few bands that have like really, you can tell they've kind of captured that and they've built their whole project around the mystery, and they've even diminished themselves to the point of being anonymous to like
Right.
Keep the focus on that. And I don't know if I told you this, but I had a real Jungian scholar on the pod like a couple of months ago, Kevin Liu. And he what's funny is he wanted to have a pre-talk before we recorded. And he organically brought them up to me like, have you by chance heard about this band?
Oh,
like,
no.
please say you're about to say it. And it was. And then we just nerded out about this band for like an hour. And then we talked about it a lot on the pod too. But yeah, there's like that. There are like these, I guess my point is that there are these different flavors of creativity. And I think the most powerful one is the one that is emanating from like the deep part of the soul. And it's not coming from that sort of like aesthetic place where they want the appearance of being a creative and they want the clapping and an admiration that comes with that. And
it's
of course,
a need.
you can never divorce the two completely, but there's only one that will really sustain you throughout your life and really motivate you throughout your life. And it's that deeper kind, that exploratory, soul catharsis kind. And as grandiose and like perhaps masturbatory as that sounds, that's the only thing that keeps me going, man. It's like, obviously I'm sure you get discouraged in your creative work sometimes, or things aren't flowing, but then you zoom out and you're like, but what else would I do? There's nothing else that scratches at this. Like there's nothing else that even comes close to allowing me to play with these ideas or learn about these ideas in some kind of way. Like, and maybe if I find that thing, I won't do this anymore. But so far I haven't.
Yeah. I mean, and it's helpful for people to understand what you're saying, that there are some people, and we would label them high creatives, and that doesn't mean they're stoned creatives as much as some of them are. But the idea being that a high creative is a person who gets so much value from spending time doing creative work. That doesn't necessarily mean even work that they're paid for, but just creative work that they're engaged in, that they feel like $1 million just doing that, just doing something meaningful in that direction. And it doesn't even mean they need to ever be discovered. I know a few artists who, they like, I'm thinking of one person in particular. He works in a museum, and he just helps with the managerial aspects of the museum and such. It's a pretty well-known, big museum here in the city. But in his spare time, he's a painter, and he like hardly ever shows in any galleries, but he just does it because he loves it, and it feeds him, And so if we recognize that those kinds of people exist, we can also be a little more understanding if like our spouse is that kind of person. Like me, I've had to have this conversation with my wife number of times, and she gets it now, and perhaps she got it even before maybe after the first conversation, but I need at some point during the week to have a handful of moments where I can pursue something creatively,
Yeah.
even not necessarily something I'm going to release to people or something, like it could be a Saturday. I'm like, hey, I just need like 45 minutes today to paint. Like it's just gonna help me psychologically, like my mental
Right.
health.
Right.
It comes down to mental and spiritual health. And I'm not saying that I'm a creative genius either. I'm just saying that I'm in this line of personality traits where doing creative work gives me so much value that it can be dangerous. Because if I was single, I probably would cut my work hours less, and I would just devote more time to it. But I got bills to pay, so it's good to recognize that those kinds of people exist. And if they are not allowed to do those creative tasks, either discouraged or basically don't have the confidence to pursue that, because it's like, well, why should I? It's a waste of time. People discourage me from it. Those people are going to be depressed. They're going to feel like they're restrained in their life,
Yeah.
and they're going to not know why they don't feel satisfied by the life that they're leading until that part gets engaged again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm gonna have to bring this up before we wrap this up, is that one of the things that is sort of a missing piece of this conversation is that in the acorn becoming the oak tree, there is this sort of alchemical progression that's being followed. Like there is this process. It's not just like, we're almost talking about it like you discover this thing and then it just sort of takes over and just does its own thing. But there are these like core stages of this, what you could call sort of psyche or soul transmutation process that occur. And you started bringing this up before, this idea of, I think you said soul transmutation, right?
Yeah, the transmutation of the soul regarding active imagination. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, I didn't even think about that fitting into all of this. But are you pulling from something specific when you reference that? When you say,
yeah, it's an actual statement by the author and Jungian analyst Jeffrey Raff,
okay,
who authored the book Jung and the Alchemical Imagination.
there seems to be this weird, and I guess this is sort of what I was alluding to before with the ritual part of dream work, where you're doing something that may seem indirect to sort of close the loop on or honor the unconscious or the dream or whatever it is, to like complete this process. And it's almost like if you were viewing your life from some kind of fourth dimensional God perspective, where it's
Mm,
you're almost viewing it as if it like as only a human, in the same way an acorn could never view itself as an oak tree, right?
mm.
You could never view yourself in the totality of your life, the things you've done, the things you've created. And let's be honest, if most of us could, we'd be pretty fucking horrified by what we'd see. We'd be like, whoa, man, way too much time, way too much doom scrolling, way too much like Pornhub time, or like whatever your um masturbation of choice is, whether literal or just
Intellectual,
procrastination or
right?
intellectual. Yeah. um and wouldn't it be amazing if we could do a check-in like that? Like, whoa,
Yeah, like once a year.
yeah,
Isn't
we got to
isn't
be
that
able
what
to.
like a DMT is or
That,
something?
yeah, good point. Yeah, that might be that. Whoa, that's a whole new perspective that I haven't
I
thought
th-
about. It's like,
yeah, I think
yeah,
everybody in society, it should be a required law. Like once a year, all the Congress people should do a DMT trip.
and it'd be great if it was like random, like it was just like the room would just get
Like
gassed with it
spike
or
the
something,
punch.
just like, today's the day, and then and then
Uh,
we all get to watch.
we get to watch
It's
on C-SPAN.
mandatory. Yeah,
Yeah,
mandatory for everyone to watch. It's the one day
it's like
C-SPAN gets good ratings. Yeah.
it's on. Check out C-SPAN. Yeah,
Um.
I'd watch it.
That's super. That's super interesting. But what I was thinking is like, what if these creative impulses, like from that point of view, is almost like what would be akin to the fuel source of the acorn becoming the oak tree, like the sunlight, the
Mm,
water, the whatever.
mm,
Clearly these things only get expressed and made manifest through this kind of like creative doing that's
mm.
novel in a way that it like requires some weird kind of faith where you don't
Yeah.
know if it's going to work, you don't know if you're going to be good at it, you don't know.
Yes.
And then even like a failure becomes a sort of like, well, that was a sacred failure, so it's fine and it's great and it's
Mm,
like beautiful. Like that would just be the
mm.
equivalent of like a shorter branch or something on the oak tree, whereas, you
Right.
know, maybe the next attempt is a longer, more beautiful branch that sprouts into like 15 other branches, you know.
Yeah.
And if you really reduce it down that way to checking in with what what is what I'm doing right now born of? Is it some, you know, obligation? Is it some, because that's fine. I have obligations. But what about this other stuff? Where is that coming from? Is this pathological? Is this just unconscious? Is this nonsense? Is this, you know, time that you need for your sanity to just play video games or doom scroll? That's fine. But beyond that, what about the sacred fuel? What about the, how are you aiming and channeling your pneuma, you know? Um the I think these are important questions that I'm not trying to say like once you peel the layer back after dying or something that you're going to like have all these things revealed to you. But I, at the same time, I have to imagine that if something like that does exist, those are the things that you'll look back on as like, I'm so grateful that I did this. I'm so
Yeah.
grateful that I created, explored, shared. Um, those are the things that I feel like really matter in some kind of strange way toward individuating.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it's important to mention in the sense of whatever the craft or medium is that you're pursuing, let's say creatively, that there's a very real practical uh, element that has to do with skill level and proficiency.
Yeah.
And so the more time you spend with a craft, obviously with deliberate practice, as they call it in psychological research, which is when you're focused on just that, all of your mental resources are dedicated to that task for 30-40 minutes, let's say, then you improve. The fascinating thing that happens is no matter what craft medium you're talking about, whether it's cooking or composing music, the higher your skill level goes, the more satisfaction you get from that activity.
Yeah. Hmm.
And the more satisfaction and the higher skill level goes, the more substantial and consequential things you can create with that activity when you are creative. And so, any of these creative figures that we talk about, the ones that are, we can label as creative geniuses, all of them also share a high proficiency in the craft that they pursue. And so there's a very practical and real motivation and encouragement that's there, that basically is, if you get so much enjoyment from creative process, or you're just curious about trying it and trying to include it as a valuable aspect in your own life, get proficient in something. You won't get as much
Yeah.
satisfaction from whatever the task is, whatever the craft is, if it's just at the amateur level. You get some dopamine fix from just the idea that you're learning something new and entertainment of that. But the sooner that you start to attain some degree of skill, um, the more rewarding it gets. Basically, that
Yes.
increases exponentially in all those other facets.
Yes, totally. Yeah, I've had the good fortune to talk to Stephen Kotler a few times. He's like a best-selling author on the subject of flow states, and it's like
Mm,
all the science says the exact same thing as what you're saying. It's like there, you don't get to enter a flow state when you're sloppy and like you're thinking exactly about like, you know, playing
right.
guitar or something. Like if you're thinking about, no, I gotta do this and I gotta do this with my hand, like you're not gonna reach a flow state, right? It's clunky, it's weird, it's not flowing. And there's something about proficiency that opens up these new levels of in not only enjoyment, but like you almost become, I personally think that flow states may be individuating in real time, because think about what's happening is
Hmm.
like the world is kind of closing down and your attention is completely unifying on one thing. You're completely existing for the sake of one creative act when you're in a flow state. Like, so in some real way, you are unifying, individuating in that moment. And maybe that's the state you need to be in to make the oak tree grow, so to speak.
There's a synchronous event happening there, is what you're
Yeah.
saying. Yeah, which is where the magic is. There's an amazing thing I stumbled on in one of my favorite musicians and in his performances, Jimi Hendrix.
Oh yeah.
So as a guitarist, no matter
I've heard of him.
no matter how good you are at guitar, no matter what that height is that you reach, you basically no one touches Jimi Hendrix.
Right.
He forms the ceiling of guitar, and no one has been able to crack that ceiling yet. No matter how virtuosic
it's
they are.
pure technicality, by the way. Like, yes, he could shred and stuff like that, but I could show you 15 guys on Instagram who are better shredders than Jimi Hendrix.
Okay, right.
But yeah, continue.
So the idea of like this fascinating confluence of factors and moments where situations are presented that are sometimes once in a lifetime. Like, as an example, the first Woodstock concert, Jimi Hendrix and his band were on the bill, and they were running late because the car died on the way. And so they dropped him in with a helicopter. Out he comes with his guitar and everything. The band's already waiting. And they get started. And they have more time on the set than they know what to do with. They haven't ironed out all of the songs yet. And so during a pause between songs, Jimi Hendrix, without letting anybody know, just starts playing the national anthem. And this is around the time of, the counterculture movement. This is around the time of Vietnam and the draft. And everybody in that audience knew someone who knew someone who either died in Vietnam or is currently there. And here comes Jimi Hendrix just spontaneously playing this distorted, aggressive, violent version of the national anthem spontaneously. And the band, was interviewed many years later, and they said, "Oh yeah, no, he just started that, and we improvised around him." So the drummer's coming in, and the bassist is doing his things, the conga player is doing his things, but they're just reacting to him, just doing this improvisation, and it goes down as one of the most famous renditions of the national anthem. It gets played in football stadiums or even I heard it in a video game once and such. But it's this spontaneous moment of somebody in very high proficiency in their abilities, kind of just the confluence of factors, and they meet it, and they just kind of embraced it, and they let it happen. It's just this magical moment, where it's hard to describe what that is. That's just the genius coming in, right?
Yes, very much so. Yeah, it's a very almost mercurial moment too, where like some kind of barrier gets turned off between you and something else, and it's almost like just you don't. I don't think the conscious mind is making decisions at that point, and whatever that is wild. And and to your point, if you don't have the proficiency, it immediately leaves. Like there's no way to express the thing without the proficiency. But there's that other great Woodstock story too about Santana, where they show up and they're told like you're going to play at night or something, and they all just get absolutely ripped on LSD, and they're like, "You're playing now. You have to play now."
Really?
Yeah, and that like there's all these and it's that legendary Santana performance. And like if you watch him, like you can totally tell like, oh yeah, he is high right now.
Wow.
But in interviews he'll talk, but it's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. And it's otherworldly and jammy and improvisy and crazy. And in interviews he'll be like, yeah, the neck of the guitar felt like a snake. And I was like simultaneously so focused and keyed in, but also just at the very limit of like what I could control. And it was just like this like roaring energy that I could barely stay on top of. And like, that's another one of those moments where it's like, he doesn't fully know what he's doing, but because he's who he was able to like exponentially increase that moment.
Wow. Imagine if it
Yeah.
would have been just like a complete, utter
Yeah, I
disaster.
know.
And
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that would be the end of his career.
Probably,
Like,
yeah, probably. Yeah, and
oh my
there's
God.
stories like that in Soul's Code too. I think Lawrence Hillman just reminded me of one the other day. I think it was pretty sure it was Ella Fitzgerald. But anyway, as a kid, she was like supposed to dance in some, in front of some audience. And then she just immediately decided to sing. Like she didn't even, it
Mm,
wasn't planned. She just started singing. Like just something took her over. She's like, I'm going to sing instead. And
right.
obviously we know who she is now.
Yeah.
um,
Beautiful, amazing voice. Yeah.
yeah. Hey
Huh.
man, another fantastic mind meld. Um,
Indeed.
we will definitely do many more, I'm sure. Tell people everything you have going on, because you have one of the very best podcasts in the universe.
Oh man. Well, likewise, I very much appreciate that. Yeah, just the check out the show. I'm currently working on a series about the fashion designer Alexander McQueen and unraveling and dissecting his creative genius in his life. So that's on my show, Creative Codex. That's Codex. And yeah, check me out on Instagram at my name, MJDorian. And otherwise, yeah, I'm going to keep on trucking, tapping into that creative genius juice as much as I can.
I enjoy drinking the juice with you, my friend.
And what a tasty juice it is.